This presentation is titled Understanding the European Accessibility Act. So what we're going to do is we're just going to work through the most important sections in the European Accessibility Act. I'm going to tell you what each section is about and then give you better context for what your requirements and or obligations might be under each section. So in this presentation, we really are zooming out and we're not looking at the specifics, but we're trying to better understand what the European Accessibility Act is and what all of these different sections mean. If you need help with accessibility and compliance, you can go to accessible.org/EAA, and there you will find many resources to help you. Also, on this channel, I will be publishing more videos that get into the specifics and the actual details. So those videos will be on this channel as well. And then one more note before we continue on with the presentation, I do have the certified accessible seal from accessible.org on this cover slide. And this is just meant to indicate that we do offer certification for digital accessibility. Now, continuing on, what is the European Accessibility Act? Well, the European Accessibility Act is a directive that requires products and services in the European Union to be accessible to people with disabilities. Now, notice I said the word directive. What is a directive? A directive is a legislative act that sets out requirements that all EU member states must meet, but it allows each country to decide how to incorporate these requirements into their national laws. So national authorities have flexibility in choosing how to implement the requirements. And a real life analogy here is, let's say we have a parent and a child, and the parent tells the child, I need you to clean your room by tomorrow. It doesn't matter how you get this done, just make sure that you clean your room. So that's what we get at with a directive. Is it's not that you have to do everything a certain way, but just that you must reach the end result. All right, so what is the purpose of the European Accessibility Act? Well, obviously, there's the overriding social purpose, which is to ensure that people with disabilities have access. But then there's the commercial aspect of this, and that is to make it easier to sell products and services across the European Union without worrying about the country specific compliance requirements. So the European Union has 27 countries, it's comprised of 27 countries. And if each of these countries have varying accessibility requirements, it can frustrate commerce and be very difficult to know whether or not you can sell in all of these countries. And then you have to make various modifications and additional compliance efforts, and it can be confusing and really it can bog down commerce. So the EAA is meant to harmonize all of these various requirements into one set of accessibility requirements and obligations. So that's what's happening here. So just one set of requirements versus, in theory, it could be 27 different sets of accessibility requirements. All right, so now looking at the actual act itself, what does the first section mean? And when I say first section, I'm talking about, let's call them paragraphs 1 through 104. Well, here we're really getting the background of the directive. So the legislators are explaining the intent, purpose, and objectives behind the European Accessibility Act. They are also providing context and background for the various requirements and obligations. And then we also have clarification about how certain sections should be interpreted. And then there is the explanation on why the legislation is necessary and how the EAA relates to other legislation. So this is kind of like a companion guide for the actual requirements, because here, if you don't understand anything in the various articles, then you can come back to this first section and get a better idea of what the drafters of this directive were thinking and what their intent was. And so that can help you understand whether how to interpret maybe a section that isn't 100% clear. This can give you a better context and then ultimately help you better understand what the requirements and obligations are. All right, and so now we'll just go to Article 2, which is scope. And this simply covers what is and isn't covered by the European Accessibility Act. And by the way, if you want to open up the European Accessibility Act, which I will link to in the description, you can follow through and use this presentation as a companion guide as you go through the different sections. And then moving on to Article 3, now we have definitions. And this section sets out what all of the key terms in the European Accessibility Act mean. So if you are unclear of what something means, it's likely going to be set out in the definitions. So you can just look back at this section for clarity and understand what exactly something means. So a prime example of this is a micro enterprise. You might think to yourself, well, what is a micro enterprise? Well, that's going to be set out in the definitions. So as you are working through the act, you can look back and look to what exactly these terms mean so that you can unpack who is required to do something or what the obligation is or what the accessibility requirement is. The definition section is going to be very, very helpful in that regard. Moving on to Article 4, we have the accessibility requirements. Now, importantly, this doesn't set out all of the technical requirements. What it actually is it's more like a table of contents that tells you where to find the requirements for member states, products, and services. So this is more like a reference section that references other sections, particularly the annex portion of the European Accessibility Act, which is towards the end. So here we do have Article 4 accessibility requirements. Just know that this is going to reference other sections. Moving on to Article 7, we have the obligations of manufacturers. And this really is the start of what I call the paperwork section of the European Accessibility Act. So here, when you read obligations, these aren't the technical accessibility requirements. Think of these more as the documentation and the certification and the verification and the record keeping. This is that type of stuff. So this is the paperwork and the procedural work. It's not the actual accessibility requirements, but we do notice that these various entities that are all playing a part in commerce, they all have these different obligations. So here in Article 7, we have the obligations of manufacturers. I'm going to read through this, but just know that in these next slides, we're going to see very similar obligations. So here, the documentation, certification, and record keeping requirements for manufacturers must follow. So let me rephrase this. So here is the documentation, certification, and record keeping requirements that manufacturers must follow to prove that their products meet accessibility standards. So here it's about the paperwork and the procedures to demonstrate compliance, not the actual accessibility requirements themselves. Similarly, in Article 9, we have obligations of importers. So here, the documentation and verification requirements importers must follow to ensure they're only bringing compliant, accessible products in the European Union marketplace. So when we go through these sections, what you'll notice is there are really checks in place to ensure that products and services are going to be accessible, because we have multiple people that are a part of the supply chain that are going to ensure that these products and services are accessible. So really here we have the different roles that are being played. They're all contributing to the accessibility and ensuring the accessibility of products and services. But continuing on with the obligations of importers, it's the paperwork again and again, the procedural rules for importers to verify and prove that products they import meet accessibility standards. So what they're going to be doing is they're going to be checking certificates, they're going to be keeping records, and they'll be handling problems with potentially non-compliant products. And then Article 10 speaks to the obligations of distributors. So distributors could be retailers, they could be sellers. And this section outlines the documentation and verification requirements that these distributors must follow when selling products. So this is going to include checking for proper accessibility certification and handling non-compliant products. Moving on to Article 13, we have the obligations of service providers. So again, here we're looking at the documentation and procedural requirements that the service providers must follow to prove that their services meet accessibility standards. And this is going to include keeping records, providing public information, and handling instances of non-compliance. So this concludes the paperwork and the procedural aspects here. But when you come across obligations, don't think of specific accessibility requirements. Think of the surrounding requirements to ensure that the technical accessibility is in place. All right, and so with Article 14, we talk about the fundamental alteration of products and services or the disproportionate burden that is placed on manufacturers or service providers for these accessibility requirements. So this is potentially an exception to meeting all of the technical accessibility requirements. But what's important is to not think of this as a get out of jail free card, so to speak. It does provide real relief for those entities that need it. So if there is a fundamental alteration of the product or service, or if it would just be too expensive for the manufacturer or the service provider to make their products completely accessible, this provides for relief. But this is not a catch-all where you can just deem that it's too difficult or that your product or service would be fundamentally altered. You're going to have to prove that this is the case, and then you're going to have to be able to justify this. So there is documentation involved, and you still have to work on accessibility to the extent that there is not a fundamental alteration or disproportionate burden. So let me read through what I have on the slide. When organizations can be excused from accessibility requirements if changes would fundamentally alter the product or service or be too expensive, organizations must document and justify this claim, review it, and still make accessibility improvements where possible. So that's what Article 14 gets at. It's very important to know that it's not as easy as making a claim of fundamental alteration or disproportionate burden, but that is Article 14. Now moving to Articles 16 through 18, we have CE marking. And these articles explain how organizations officially declare their products meet accessibility requirements through CE marking. And CE marking is the European Union's mark indicating a product meets safety, health, and environmental protection requirements. And obviously here, this would pertain to accessibility requirements. So that's what the CE marking here is getting at. So it covers what must be included in the declaration, where to put the CE mark on products, and how compliance is enforced. So that's what's going to be contained in Articles 16 through 18. And then in Articles 19 through 22, we have market surveillance. So this explains how authorities check if products meet accessibility requirements and what happens if they don't. It covers investigating suspected violations, requiring fixes, and potentially banning non-compliant products. And then now we get into the final portion of the European Accessibility Act, which is we start with Annex 1, and then we will get to subsequent annexes in a moment. But for Annex 1, this is where we finally find the technical accessibility requirements. So Annex 1 details the specific requirements for making products and services accessible. It explains what features and capabilities need to be included. And this is going to be like providing information in multiple formats, making interfaces adaptable, ensuring compatibility with assistive technologies, and making all functions usable by people with different types of disabilities. So here we get into the actual specifics. So Annex 1 is an extremely important section. And then we have Annex 2, which provides a really nice complement to Annex 1, because here we have examples of these technical requirements in action, in practice. So Annex 2 is an extremely helpful section that provides examples of how to meet the technical requirements in Annex 1. And then we have Annex 4, and this gets at the conformity assessment procedure for products. And I had to abbreviate this because that title is so long. But Annex 4 explains how manufacturers must document and prove their products meet accessibility requirements. It outlines the paperwork, manufacturing checks, and certification steps needed to show compliance with the law. And then we have Annex 5, which is information on services meeting the accessibility requirements. And this explains what information service providers must include in their terms and conditions about how their service meets accessibility requirements. They need to prove compliance through documentation and ongoing monitoring. So, again, this is an overview of this section, and we will get into details in other videos. And then we have Annex 6, and this is criteria for assessing disproportionate burden. So here we have how organizations can calculate if making their products or services accessible would cost so much as to be considered a disproportionate burden. And this section includes formulas for calculating costs and assessing whether the disproportionate burden threshold has been met. All right, so now we have gone through the most important sections in the EAA that most people will be concerned with. And now you have a better feel for the European Accessibility Act as a whole. But obviously, what we want to do now is we want to start focusing in on the specifics. And in later videos, that's what I will get into. We will start hyper focusing in on these various sections and these various articles and the different annexes, and start to learn more about the different requirements and obligations of these different parties that are involved in commerce. So again, if you would like to learn more about accessibility and compliance, I have compiled resources at accessible.org/EAA. And at accessible.org, we can help you with training, consulting, and services. If you would like to reach out to me directly, you can email me at Kris, Kris, at accessible.org. And that's really what I have here is just the certified accessible seal and then the domain name accessible.org. I will include more resources in the description for this video. And then, of course, you can find other videos where we get into specifics and really start breaking down the European Accessibility Act.